Gavin Rourke's punch sent Micah Reed into a display table in the main hall, right in front of men in tailored suits who did not flinch, because none of them had thought to ask why a black man in a mechanic's jacket was trying to reach a billionaire. Gavin grabbed Micah by the collar and started pulling him toward the exit, but his hand snagged on a silver ring on Micah's right hand. The arrow and blade engraved into the band stopped Gavin cold. He let go, stepped back, and called the man he had just struck by a title only the living had earned the right to hear. If you want to know why that silver ring silenced an entire room, subscribe now and stay with this story all the way to the end. The Ashbourne Crown Hotel had been dressed for theater long before the first guest arrived, its marble lobby wrapped in silk banners bearing the Ashbourne Strategic Technologies seal. Every corridor fitted with amber lighting, designed to suggest that a company announcing a $5.8 billion defense partnership was not merely successful but inevitable, and the guests who moved through the main hall knew that the event was the kind that made careers by association rather than by merit. Landon Ashbourne, the company's chief operating officer, worked the room with the practiced ease of a man who had learned confidence as a performance rather than a state of being, pausing at each cluster of attorneys and logistics executives to deliver the right amount of attention at the right moment, because tonight mattered more to him than any previous night in his professional life. At the center of the stage, still covered under a projection screen, was the system he had staked his future on, Aegis Meridian, billed as the most resilient emergency relay architecture ever proposed for field deployment, capable of maintaining encrypted communication under conditions designed to destroy anything less robust. Sterling Ashbourne, the company's founder and chairman, stood near the stage entrance, speaking with Everett Blackwell of Blackwell Defense Holdings, two men whose combined influence over the American defense landscape had made the $5.8 billion figure feel less like a contract and more like a scheduled formality. If the product performed as advertised tonight, in front of the people whose approval it needed most, Landon would move from chief operating officer to chief executive without opposition. And the years he had spent managing suppliers, cutting costs, and positioning himself as the heir apparent to something larger than a corporation would finally deliver their return. The agreement being celebrated was not a beginning but a culmination, and every table arrangement, every placement of a trade publication photographer, and every word on the printed program had been designed to make that feel irreversible. Micah Reed arrived at 21 minutes past 8 in a canvas work coat with a seam repaired at the left shoulder, metal dust still visible on his forearms from a relay testing site he had left less than 2 hours before, carrying an evidence box in one hand and moving through the hotel entrance with the quiet economy of someone who had learned not to announce himself in rooms that wanted to dismiss him. He was 43 years old, tall, with a face that had absorbed more years than it showed, and the silver ring on his right hand caught the lobby light once and then disappeared back into shadow as he moved toward the reception desk. In the box he carried a storage drive, an 83-page technical report, and a burned-out relay module pulled from a test unit that morning, and in his coat pocket was a formal invitation signed by Celeste Ashbourne, who had read his report 6 days earlier and arranged his access without informing her nephew. What Micah had found during inspection was not a calibration issue or a vendor defect but a structural vulnerability embedded in the Aegis Meridian architecture itself. If 3 relay nodes received a specific spoofed authentication signal at the same time, they would validate each other in a cascading loop, and the system's own error correction process would lock the network, close every emergency channel, and leave operators unable to restart it remotely from any point in the field. The original design, built under a contract Micah had fulfilled 4 years earlier, had included a hardware interrupt mechanism that prevented exactly this failure mode, a safeguard he had engineered from experience rather than theory, but the mechanism had been quietly removed by Landon's engineering team as part of a cost reduction that saved the company $18 million and eliminated the only barrier between the system and its own destruction. Every warning Micah had submitted over the preceding months had been received, logged, and set aside. The reception desk attendant looked at his jacket, looked at the event banner, and told him that maintenance contractors used the service entrance on the east side of the building. Micah placed his invitation on the counter in silence, and before the attendant could finish reading it, Landon Ashbourne arrived from a nearby conversation cluster and took the letter from the desk, as though inspecting something left behind accidentally. Announced in a tone calibrated for the people standing within earshot that subcontractors did not have standing at leadership events, and handed the letter back to an aide with an instruction that left no room for discussion. Celeste was 3 floors above in a board session that had run past schedule, unreachable by the time Micah needed her most, and he understood that he was standing in a lobby with no institutional protection, no rank, no relationship, and nothing except the truth and the 47 minutes remaining before the live activation test began. He told Landon, without raising his voice, that the demonstration needed to be stopped before the system connected to the live relay network, that he had documented the failure condition and could reproduce it on demand, and that he was not there for money, but to prevent the company from activating a known kill switch in front of the people whose approval it needed most. Landon turned to the nearest cluster of guests, gestured toward Micah with the relaxed dismissal of a man removing something from a clean surface, and said loudly enough to carry that what they were watching was the frustration of a wire technician who had convinced himself he was indispensable, that the company had reviewed his submissions, and that there was nothing actionable in any of them. He then swept the evidence box off the table edge with his forearm in a motion casual enough to read as accidental, and the printed schematics scattered across the polished floor in a wide arc that drew a brief, collective silence from the people nearest to it. Micah crouched to gather the relay module, which had rolled toward the base of a display pedestal, and as he reached for it, Landon's voice carried across the room at full volume, with a single word directed at the security team posted near the hall entrance, and the word was not a description but a signal, freighted with an implication that required no explanation in a room where private security teams were trained to respond to exactly that category of alert. Gavin Rourke was across the floor in 4 seconds, moving with the controlled speed of a man who had done this before and knew precisely how much force to apply to end a situation without escalating it. And the strike he delivered to Micah's upper body was a professional reflex rather than an act of malice, and it drove Micah into the side of the nearest table, with enough impact that the room registered it in full and went quiet in the same instant. Gavin closed his hand around Micah's collar and began the sequence that would move him toward the nearest exit, completing the task the way he had been trained to complete it, and then his right hand closed around Micah's wrist to control the arm, and his thumb found the edge of the silver ring. He turned the ring without thinking, the way hands move when they have been trained to search for identifying information, and the symbol came into the light, an arrow crossing a sword blade at 45 degrees, and below it, in letters small enough to require closeness to read, the designation OD 5985, and 4 words that Gavin had not seen written anywhere in 12 years. He released Micah's wrist and stepped back, and his face went through 4 expressions in the space of 2 seconds, because the man whose collar he had grabbed was not a stranger, and every instinct Gavin had built across a decade of civilian work had just failed him in the one moment that mattered. He straightened, looked at Micah, and said the rank and name into the silence of a room that had expected something much simpler, and the words landed the way words do when they reframe everything that came before them. Master Sergeant Reed. Micah did not respond with the name or the greeting or any of the things that old soldiers say when they find each other in unexpected places. He looked at Gavin steadily, the way a man looks when he is waiting for the situation to clarify itself, and the situation clarified in the expression on Gavin's face, which was moving through something that had no civilian equivalent. Gavin turned to the room, which had not resumed its conversations, and said that the man he had just struck had once carried him out of a destroyed relay station under direct fire, and that if anyone in that room wanted to understand what was happening, the correct response was not to walk away, but to listen. Landon said that whatever history existed between a contractor and a member of the security staff was immaterial to the business of the evening, that the event was running behind schedule, and that the display of personal sentimentality was not a justification for disrupting a formal announcement. Sterling Ashbourne, who had not moved from his position near the stage, was watching Micah in a way that was different from the way he had been watching him 30 seconds earlier, with the focused attention of a man who has spent decades learning to distinguish between people who are performing authority and people who possess it. And what he was seeing now did not fit either of his prepared categories. He crossed the floor to where Micah was standing, looked at the ring, looked at the man wearing it, and asked one question without preface. Why was a person with that background doing wire work? Micah answered it the way he answered everything, without revision or apology, because the version of himself he had brought to this building was the only version he had available. He said he had left the military because his wife became ill and his daughter needed a parent at home, that the illness had ended by taking the person rather than the problem, and that the work he had built afterward had started with the contracts no established firm wanted and had grown from there, and that he had never found a form of honest labor he was unable to respect. Gavin, who was collecting the last of the printed pages from the floor, stopped and spoke into the larger silence, because there was a version of the night's history that the people in this room needed to hear, and he was the only person present who could tell it truthfully. He described a communications blackout during an isolated operation 12 years earlier, a personnel accounting error that had left him off the extraction manifest, and the order to withdraw that had been issued while the relay station was still active, and he was still inside it. He said Micah had reviewed the manifest himself during the hold period, found the discrepancy independently, and returned to a zone already marked unsafe. That the protocol Micah had improvised on site had guided the rescue team to his exact position through interference conditions that should have made communication impossible, and that when the debrief came, Micah had declined the individual commendation and requested that the citation be distributed across the unit. The ring, he said, was made by a craftsman near the base and given personally by Micah to each surviving member of the team, engraved with the operation designation and the rule the team had lived by before it was ever written down. Sterling asked for the technical report itself, not a summary, and Gavin handed it to him, and Sterling turned to the index page and found what Micah had known he would find. In the technical authorship appendix of the Aegis Meridian documentation, listed among the foundational protocols underpinning the entire architecture, was the designation Reed Containment Protocol, attributed to an independent contractor identified as M. Reed in a subcontract executed 4 years earlier. Landon said quickly that the company had purchased the protocol through a standard intellectual property transfer agreement, and that the original contractor had been fully compensated, which was accurate in one sense and entirely misleading in another, because the agreement had licensed the protocol for civilian infrastructure applications only, and every military and defense application required a separate authorization that had never been requested, never granted, and never referenced in any of the procurement documentation prepared for Blackwell Defense Holdings. Micah took a folded copy of the licensing agreement from his coat pocket, the original document, with the relevant clause underlined in ink, and set it on the table where Sterling could read it without reaching. He said that the Aegis Meridian contract, as currently structured, was built on intellectual property that had not been licensed for the application to which it was being put, and that if the demonstration proceeded and the contract was executed without correction, the violation would be on record. He paused, then added that if the test began before those corrections were made, he would file the infringement notice before the building was cleared for the night. Helena Whitmore, the company's chief legal counsel, who had been summoned by Celeste and had arrived during the exchange, opened her file and confirmed without qualification that the licensing restriction Micah described was present in the original agreement, that the protocol had been renamed in the public-facing technical documentation, and that no renegotiation of the underlying terms had taken place. Sterling removed Micah from the main hall with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood that the most consequential conversations were the ones that took place in front of the fewest witnesses, and the private meeting room he used was furnished with the utilitarian calm of a space designed for decisions rather than hospitality. The terms he laid out in the first 3 minutes were composed and comprehensive. A full acquisition of Reed Signal Works at a valuation representing roughly 4 times the company's current revenue. A personal settlement for the events of the evening, an endowed scholarship fund designated for Micah's daughter, an honorary advisory position on the board, and a private exit from the building arranged to avoid the photographers near the main entrance. Sterling had structured offers like this before, which was evident in the absence of any acknowledgement that the proposal itself was a form of erasure, and Micah sat across from him and waited for him to finish before responding. And then he said no, without qualifying it or attaching a counterfigure to it, and the refusal confused Sterling more than its content, because every man Sterling had negotiated with across 4 decades of business had come to the table with a number he was eventually willing to accept. Micah said the problem was not financial and could not be resolved financially, and that any agreement about the intellectual property would need to reflect the actual terms of the original contract rather than override them. His phone showed a message from Marin Shaw, Director of Product Integrity, 4 lines long, saying that the internal test data Sterling had been shown in his briefings was not the actual test data, that the system had failed its field simulation 4 times in the preceding 3 months, and that each failure had been logged as auxiliary equipment error at the direction of the person managing the demonstration timeline. Micah read the message, set the phone face down, and told Sterling there was a second matter that required resolution before the intellectual property conversation could proceed. He described the failure mechanism in the same direct language he had used with Landon in the lobby. 3 relay nodes configured in a mutual confirmation structure. A spoofed authentication token capable of triggering a cascade lock, and a recovery process that would close every emergency channel for between 9 and 22 minutes, while making remote intervention impossible. He said the internal records would confirm that this exact failure mode had produced 4 documented system failures that had been reclassified to protect the launch schedule, and that the module in his evidence box was physical evidence of a 5th occurrence. Sterling's expression did not break, but something behind it shifted, in the way that faces shift when a person realizes the information they have been operating on was a story someone else needed them to believe rather than an accurate representation of the situation. Micah placed 3 requests on the table, none of which involved money. The demonstration needed to be stopped before the live relay connection was made. The raw test data needed to be secured by a party independent of Landon's division, and an external technical audit needed to be commissioned before the Blackwell contract could proceed in any form. Sterling agreed to a 15-minute delay, which was not what Micah had asked for, offered with the confidence of a man who believed his company's institutional weight could absorb most forms of risk if managed carefully. Landon, watching through the glass panel from the hallway, turned and walked in the opposite direction toward the technical operations room, and told the lead technician to begin the activation sequence on schedule, regardless of what was being discussed elsewhere in the building. Everett Blackwell arrived at the meeting room 7 minutes into the delay, and asked, with the contained patience of a man whose time had been carefully allocated for the evening, why the schedule had changed. Landon introduced Micah as a vendor involved in a billing dispute, a description precise enough to be technically defensible and inaccurate enough to be deliberately misleading, and Everett looked at Micah the way experienced people look at a situation when the framing they have been given does not match the texture of what they are observing. Micah placed the burned relay module on the table and explained the failure mechanism without academic qualification, in the language of someone who wanted to be understood rather than impressive. The Aegis Meridian authentication architecture used 3 primary relay nodes in a mutual confirmation protocol, each validating the other 2 before passing a signal through, which was intended as a security feature, but the same structure that made the system resistant to outside intrusion made it catastrophically vulnerable to a specific internal cascade, in which identical spoof tokens arriving within a narrow timing window would trigger all 3 nodes into a shared error state, causing the system's own recovery protocol to lock the network and take every emergency communication channel offline simultaneously. He said the process, once started, could not be interrupted remotely, could not be reset without physical access to each node separately, and would take between 9 and 22 minutes to complete depending on system load, during which the people relying on those channels would have no contact with each other and no way to know when the blackout would end. Everett asked who had designed the original containment architecture, and Helena Whitmore confirmed from the contract file that the foundational protocol was the Reed Containment Protocol, developed by Micah Reed under a subcontract 4 years prior, licensed for civilian use only, and renamed in the public-facing documentation without any renegotiation of the underlying terms. Gavin said that the protocol Micah had described was not a theoretical model, but an architecture built and tested under battlefield conditions, revised based on actual failure rather than projected failure, and that the version now embedded in Aegis Meridian was missing the component that made the original design trustworthy, removed not because it was technically unnecessary, but because it was financially inconvenient. Landon, who had returned to the room after giving the activation instruction, heard Gavin speak and made the decision that was characteristic of a person who had never learned the difference between attacking a person and countering an argument. He produced a document on his phone and said that before the room accepted Micah Reed's technical judgment, they should be aware of a military disciplinary record associated with his service, documenting an unauthorized breach of a withdrawal order, unauthorized equipment use, and conduct that had caused an operational delay during a sensitive mission. Micah did not deny any of it. He said the record existed, that it did not contain the complete account of what had occurred, that he had accepted the terms of the internal process at the time, and that he had no interest in revisiting it now. Gavin's face had gone still in the way that faces do when a person is calculating what they are obligated to say against what it will cost them to say it, and Landon ordered the summary projected on the room's wall screen, and it appeared in large text, and the room read it, and Micah sat with his hands flat on the table and did not look away. The document on the wall listed 5 findings in sequence: failure to comply with an authorized withdrawal order, return to a designated hazard zone without command approval, use of non-standard communications equipment during an active operation, delay of unit extraction by an estimated 40 minutes, and acceptance of an administrative corrective action in lieu of formal charges. The people who had gathered near the doorway read the list without the context to understand what it meant, which was precisely the calculation Landon had made, because a list of violations extracted from a classified file and shown to civilians was not information but suggestion. And the suggestion was that the man challenging the technical standards of a $5.8 billion system had a record of poor judgment when the pressure was real. Landon said that the ring was evidence of service, not of reliable decision-making, and that the room should consider what kind of contractor submitted reports designed to halt a major transaction, while simultaneously holding a licensing claim that would entitle him to renegotiate the terms. Gavin spoke from where he was standing, in a voice that was flat and without drama, because he was not performing anything. He said the mission cited in that document was the same mission in which Micah had saved his life, and that the summary on the wall did not include the reason Micah had returned to the hazard zone. He told the room that a personnel officer had submitted an extraction manifest with a clerical error that omitted his name from the evacuation list, and that a senior officer, aware of the omission, had chosen to proceed with the withdrawal rather than delay the timeline and risk an inquiry into who had approved the final headcount. Micah had reviewed the manifest independently during the hold period found the discrepancy, and returned to a zone where his request to delay the extraction had been formally denied twice before he went anyway, because the alternative was leaving a person behind who had been made invisible by paperwork. The protocol he improvised on site, using non-standard equipment in a signal jamming environment, had guided the rescue team to the exact position of the station through interference that should have made communication impossible, and 5 other people were alive, because the documentation Micah, secured before the station went dark, had allowed the correct decisions to be made. Gavin said that Micah had been offered a commendation and redirected it to the team, because he said that accepting individual recognition for a mission where someone had almost been left behind was not something he could do in good conscience. He reached under his collar, drew out a cord, and unclipped from it a ring identical to the one on Micah's hand, the same silver, the same arrow and blade, the same inscription, and he set it on the table beside Micah's, and the 2 rings lying next to each other made the projection on the wall behind them look like exactly what it was. Celeste Ashbourne entered, carrying a printed copy of the full military record, which Helena Whitmore had obtained through the board's verification authority in the preceding 22 minutes, and she placed it on the table, and the complete file contained the commendations the summary had omitted, the after-action testimony of 5 personnel whose positions had been confirmed by Micah's improvised protocol, and a notation from the presiding officer, stating that the administrative action had been accepted voluntarily, and that no finding of misconduct had been sustained. Sterling asked Landon where the summary version of the file had originated, and the silence that followed told him what he needed to know before Landon answered. The document had come from a private investigation firm, which meant Landon had authorized a search for damaging information on Micah before the evening began, which meant the reports Micah had submitted had been read and taken seriously enough that Landon had spent money preparing to discredit their author. An alert tone sounded from the technical operations station at the rear of the room, and the status display changed, and the indicator showed that Aegis Meridian had been brought to active status and was initializing a connection to the live demonstration relay network without authorization from anyone present who held the authority to order it. The monitors throughout the demonstration floor lit up in sequence, and the Ashbourne technical team at the operations console began their status commentary in the confident voices of people who had not been told that anything in the building had changed, and the initialization numbers were populating correctly. The relay handshakes were completing in sequence, and every visible indicator was performing exactly as the demonstration documentation had described. Landon watched the sequence progress on the nearest screen and allowed himself the expression of a man who had decided that the outcome would justify the decision. And he looked at Micah across the room with a directness that was intended to communicate, without words, that the conversation about licensing and protocols and burned modules was now academic because the product was working, and the room could see it working. Micah looked at the signal pattern on the center display, watched the 3rd authentication cycle complete, watched the 4th, and then identified in the interval between relay confirmations that the pattern was not steady-state operation, but a repeating test loop cycling at a frequency that would eventually synchronize all 3 primary nodes into the exact authentication window that produced the failure condition he had documented and brought to this building with an 83-page report that no one had been willing to read. He said there were fewer than 4 minutes before the network locked, and the room did not immediately believe him, because the screens were green and the technicians were reading normal values, and the product was doing what its marketing materials promised. Landon directed the security team to remove Micah from the operations area, and Gavin moved to stand between Micah and the 2 officers who responded, and said that his responsibility was to protect Sterling Ashbourne from genuine harm, not to remove a qualified engineer from a room where his presence might prevent an infrastructure failure, and that if Landon wanted to override that judgment, he was welcome to take it up with Sterling directly. The first sign of the failure came from the secondary display, which stopped updating its counter and held the last number it had received. And then, the primary relay confirmation panel showed a status it had not shown before. A yellow indicator reading reconciliation active, which was the system's internal label for the error correction process that could not be externally interrupted once it started. One by one, the communication terminals in the room went dark. The security door at the hall entrance sealed automatically because it was integrated into the same relay network. The internal intercom produced static, and the test call running on speaker with the Blackwell Operations Center went silent mid-sentence without warning or ceremony. No person was harmed, and no classified material was exposed, and the failure was contained entirely within the demonstration environment. But what had been scheduled as a celebration was now a technical autopsia, conducted in front of the people the company needed most to impress. And the damage to the evening was exactly the kind that no press release could fully repair. Landon told Micah to restore the system immediately, and Micah said that before he touched anything, Landon needed to confirm publicly and on the record that Micah Reed held technical authority over the Reed containment protocol, and that the warnings he had submitted had been credible and had been deliberately set aside. Sterling stepped to the front of the room and said, in the hearing of every remaining guest, that Micah Reed was the author of the foundational protocol, that the architecture had been modified without the author's authorization, and that the concerns Mr. Reed had submitted over the preceding months had not received the attention they required, and that this was a failure of leadership for which the company was accountable. Micah removed a secondary component from the evidence box, walked the technical team through a manual restoration sequence that required 7 steps and the physical cooperation of 2 additional staff members, and guided the process without taking shortcuts, because the system had been designed to require human confirmation at each recovery stage. And he was not going to bypass that design now, not even to make the room more comfortable. After 11 minutes, the network came back online, and Everett Blackwell stood from the console where he had been watching and announced that Blackwell Defense Holdings was suspending the partnership pending an independent technical review of the full system architecture and all associated test documentation. The board of Ashbourne Strategic Technologies convened within the hour, in a room that had been prepared for a victory dinner, and was now cleared of everything except chairs and a projector, and the printed agenda had been replaced by a whiteboard on which Celeste Ashbourne had written 4 words. What did we know? Landon opened by framing the evening as a compounding of external interference and internal miscommunication, and he distributed the responsibility across multiple parties. Marin Shaw had not escalated the test anomalies through the correct channels. The technical team had executed a command they should have sought clarification on. Gavin Rourke had allowed a personal relationship to override professional protocol, and the failure during the demonstration had occurred in a controlled simulation environment, rather than field conditions, a distinction the board should weigh carefully before drawing conclusions about the product's viability. Celeste asked Landon to stop and gave Micah the floor, and Micah accepted it without performance, setting his materials on the table and presenting them chronologically, the way a person briefs when they want to be accurate rather than persuasive. The record he assembled showed 14 written warnings submitted to Landon's office over 5 months, all of which had been opened according to document access logs, and none of which had received a substantive response, alongside the original test data, documenting 4 system failures in the field simulation, and the revised version submitted to Blackwell Defense Holdings, in which each failure was described as an isolated auxiliary equipment error, unrelated to the core architecture. It showed the procurement order authorizing removal of the hardware interrupt component to reduce unit cost by $18 million, approved by Landon's signature alone without going to the Engineering Review Committee, and an internal message time-stamped 43 minutes after Sterling had agreed to a delay, in which Landon had directed the lead technician to proceed with activation, regardless of what was being discussed in the meeting room. Marin Shaw appeared by remote connection, and confirmed without a prepared statement that Landon had told her directly that her continued employment depended on her signing the revised test documentation, that she had reported the conversation to the compliance office, and that she had received no response because the compliance officer's reporting line ran through Landon's division. Gavin submitted a formal statement acknowledging that he had struck Micah without verifying the nature of the threat, that the action had been conditioned by a workplace culture in which people without institutional standing were treated as lower probability legitimate actors, and that he was providing the board with complete footage from his personal recording device, which had been active from the moment he arrived at the event. The footage showed Landon's deliberate misdirection of the security response, including the moment he had spoken the word that prompted Gavin to move, in a context that made clear no threat existed, and that the intent had been to manufacture a confrontation rather than prevent one. Sterling watched the portion of the footage showing his son engineering a physical altercation with a man holding a technical report, and when it ended, he asked the room to clear except for board members, and before midnight the board voted to suspend Landon Ashbourne from his executive position pending the outcome of a full investigation. Landon's building access was revoked at 23 minutes past midnight, and he left through the East Corridor service exit under the supervision of 2 members of the internal security team, the same path he had tried to direct Micah toward 4 hours earlier, when Micah had arrived at the lobby with an invitation and a report that deserved to be read. Sterling found Micah in the conference room after the board had cleared, sat down across from him, and said he had been wrong about the evening, which was not the same as understanding the full scope of what had been done in his name. But it was the first time in the evening that he had said something without a transactional structure underneath it. He then presented a revised arrangement. Full ownership transfer of the Reed Containment Protocol in exchange for $40 million, a vice presidential position overseeing strategic architecture, continuity of the Blackwell Partnership under a corrected framework, discretion in shareholder communications regarding the events of the evening, and Micah's participation in the announcement, framing the leadership transition for the press. Micah declined the vice presidential position, the acquisition offer, and the discretion request, and Sterling absorbed each refusal with the expression of a man who was recalibrating rather than retreating, because he had not become what he was by failing to recognize when the terms of a negotiation had fundamentally changed. Micah said he was not interested in occupying the chair that Landon had vacated, because the problem was not who sat in the chair, but what the chair was permitted to do without accountability, and no personal advancement would repair a structural failure. He laid out 7 conditions for a legitimate renegotiated agreement. Ashbourne Strategic Technologies would formally acknowledge, in writing and in the corrected contract documentation submitted to Blackwell, that the foundational architecture of Aegis Meridian had been developed by Micah Reed under a subcontract and applied outside the terms of the original license. Reed Signal Works would remain an independent entity, not an acquisition target, and not subject to exclusivity terms preventing it from working with other clients. All test data related to Aegis Meridian, historical and future, would be audited by an independent engineering firm with no prior relationship to Ashbourne. Marin Shaw would receive written confirmation from the board that her employment was secure and that the compliance report she had filed was being acted on. Subcontractors working on Ashbourne projects would have a direct reporting line to the board safety committee that bypassed divisional management. Gavin Rourke's decision to provide evidence would not be treated as disloyalty, and the circumstances of the strike would be documented accurately, without assigning primary fault to the person who had executed a command rather than issued one. A minimum of 15% of the renegotiated contract's subcontracting allocation would be directed toward firms owned by veterans and by members of underrepresented communities. Sterling asked whether any part of this was about revenge. Micah said that revenge would mean trying to hurt Sterling, and that what he was describing was something else entirely. It was an attempt to prevent the same sequence of decisions from being applied to the next contractor who arrived at this building with documentation that inconvenienced someone with a title. Gavin found Micah in the main hall, after the conference room had cleared, the same hall where 2 hours earlier there had been a demonstration and an assault, and a silence that cost Landon everything he had spent years accumulating. And the room was quiet now except for maintenance staff disassembling the display platforms and carrying away the printed materials that had been placed so carefully and used for none of their intended purposes. He said he owed Micah a clearer account than he had managed to give in the meeting room, and Micah said the account had been clear enough. And Gavin said he meant something different. Not an explanation for the board, not one for Sterling, but an honest account given to Micah himself, because Micah deserved to understand what had happened to Gavin's judgment in the years between the mission and this evening. He said that when he had transitioned out of service and into private protective work, the role had trained him by repetition to calibrate threat by appearance. That the clients who paid for protection expected their security teams to respond to social signals and not only physical ones, and that over time he had learned to treat a certain category of person as automatically low risk and a certain other category as automatically worth watching, and that those categories had been defined not by behavior but by how a person was dressed, and whether they looked like they belonged in the space they were standing in. He said that Micah had once told him that the worst tactical error a person could make was to decide the situation before observing it, and that he had spent 12 years working in an environment that rewarded him financially for doing exactly that, and that he had allowed it because the compensation was reliable, and the work felt purposeful, even when the judgments behind it were not. Micah listened without interrupting, and when Gavin finished, he said he was not going to tell him whether to resign or remain, because the decision would need to come from what Gavin wanted to be accountable for, rather than what he wanted to be excused from. Gavin said he had already decided. He would complete the internal investigation period, provide everything the board requested, recommend specific changes to the use of force standards for the protection team based on what the evening had exposed. And when the investigation concluded, he would leave the position on his own terms, without a settlement agreement, and without signing any document that required him to stay silent about what he had witnessed. Sterling came down from the upper level and crossed the empty hall, and he said he was sorry, and he said it the way people say things when they have removed everything that makes those words easier to deliver, and there was no offer attached to it and no condition following it. Micah accepted the apology without diminishing what it cost, and without suggesting it resolved anything that needed to be resolved through action, rather than words. He picked up the evidence box from the floor where a maintenance worker had placed it, noticed the crack along the lid from when Landon had knocked it from his hands, checked the storage drive inside, which was intact, and the report, which was intact, and the burned module, which was exactly as damaged as it had been when he walked through the front entrance that evening, and closed the box and held it under his arm and said nothing more that needed saying. 6 months later, Ashbourne Strategic Technologies was smaller in headcount and larger in credibility, having completed an external audit that confirmed 3 of the 4 documented system failures and recommended a complete redesign of the relay authentication architecture before any field deployment was authorized. The partnership with Blackwell Defense Holdings was reinstated at a lower initial value under revised terms with structured milestones tied to independent verification at each stage, and the contract documents correctly identified the foundational protocol and the name of its author. Sterling lost the unilateral authority to designate a successor. A governance change the board approved as part of the conditions for the Blackwell renegotiation, and he accepted it without public objection. Landon was removed from the company following an investigation that confirmed the data falsification, the unauthorized activation order, the deliberate misdirection of the security response, and the procurement of a redacted military file through a private firm hired without board authorization. And the departure was described in the press release as a resignation, which was the last concession His attorneys successfully negotiated before the investigation's findings were finalized. Marin Shaw was appointed Director of System Safety, a newly created position reporting directly to the board, and her first action in the role was a mandatory review period between any cost reduction affecting safety-critical components and its implementation, with sign-off required from an independent engineer who had not been involved in the original design. Gavin Rourke completed the investigation period, submitted his final report, and left the Ashbourne security team on the date he had set for himself, joining an organization that prepared veterans for civilian protective roles, with a specific focus on de-escalation and on making threat assessments grounded in observed behavior rather than visual assumption. Reed Signalworks accepted a formal subcontracting role in the revised Aegis Meridian program, retained full operational independence, and did not change its name or relocate its offices, or replace the pickup truck in the parking lot. Micah received a call from Tessa one evening, brief because she had an early class, in which she said she had seen his name in a news summary and asked if he was all right, and he said he was, and she said she was proud of him, and he told her that the work that fixes something is usually less visible than the thing it fixes, and that the work would continue the same way it always had. On the day the revised contract was signed, Sterling offered Micah the seat at the head of the table, and Micah thanked him and took the chair beside the technical team instead, and before he signed, he set the silver ring on the table next to the signature line, and after he signed, he picked it up and put it back on his hand. The ring had not given him rank or leverage or access to a room that had not wanted him in it. It had done the simpler and more permanent thing, which was to tell Gavin Rourke, who was holding the other end of the collar, at the moment when that recognition was the only thing that could interrupt what was already in motion, and everything else had followed from that single instant of being seen. Micah walked out of the Ashbourne building through the front entrance, into the gray morning of a city going about its work, and the silver ring caught the light once, and then he was gone.